Good morning. I wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. I want to talk today from chapter 12 of our textbook, The Old South and Slavery from 1830 to 1860. There's a picture on page 320 of a family group. The African American woman shown here was probably a slave mammy who may have substituted for the absent mother of the children. And I would assume by the mother's absence that she was deceased, although it is possible that there could have been other reasons why she's not in the figure. In the picture, she probably was deceased. But the mammies played a very important role. She was included in the family portrait and indicates her role as a caregiver. And it is unknown whether the slave owner included her in the photo as part of the Southern Patriot paternalistic defense of slavery. It is also unknown whether he engaged in a sexual relationship, forceful or otherwise, with his slave. That was very common in the Old South since masters had absolute authority over their slaves. We've talked about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and other cases like that. Whether it was love or lust, romance or rape, it run the gamut, there's no question. And one of the worst aspects of slavery, it's reported that on numerous occasions masters were known to sell their own offspring on the auction block. There's no question in most cases who was the instigator of that. The wife, the plantation mistress, who did not want evidence of her husband's adultery right before her eyes every day. This chapter discusses a very interesting man named Nat Turner. And there were a number of slave conspiracies or rebellions that occurred during the antebellum period. In 1800, Gabriel Prosser led a revolt in Richmond, Virginia that was put down. 1822, Denmark Vesey led a conspiracy for a slave revolt in Charleston, South Carolina, which was nipped in the bud and never came to potential. And then in 1831, the most violent rebellion of all was led by Nat Turner, a Baptist preacher and mystic who had seen all kinds of signs of black and white spirits at war with one another. And he was eventually captured and he was hanged on November 11th, 1831. There's a good movie called The Birth of a Nation concerning the Nat Turner Rebellion. Before his execution, he explained his actions in his confessions, which were recorded by Thomas R. Gray, who was his court-appointed attorney. And Attorney Gray was also a slave owner. They were subsequently published. In them, Turner did not claim that he had been personally mistreated by his owners. Instead, he set forth his religious conviction that all slavery was evil, an offense against God. Turner was a religious mystic who had seen heavenly visions of white and black spirits fighting each other. Some would regard those as hallucinations, and some would take a very different interpretation of them. He was one of many slaves converted to Christianity in the decades before and after 1800 by white Baptist and Methodist preachers, many of whom later hoped that Christianity would make their slaves more docile. Many masters didn't want to instruct their slaves in religion, and some did. Some said they made better slaves if they understood the gospel through the eyes of the master. Serve and obey your masters. They'd be less likely to steal and engage in certain activities that were not uh, productive. Turner's ability to read enabled him to find biblical passages that threaten death to anyone who stealeth a man, a fair description of slavery. Asked by his lawyer if he now understood his mistake, the rebel leader defiantly replied, "Was not Christ crucified?" A niece of George Washington voiced the fear of many whites by saying that she, other white Virginians, were now living on a smoldered volcano. Many slave owners were scared to death that another Nat Turner might be living in their slave cabins. And so there's a interesting novel about this rebellion. It's called The Confessions of Nat Turner, written by William Styron. Now, a novel is a fictitious work, but he does give a uh, pretty good discussion of things that might have occurred at the time of the Nat Turner Rebellion, and a historical work that's very interesting is The Fires of Jubilee by Stephen Oates. Um, it was in 1832, a year after the rebellion, that a newspaper article appeared in Virginia in which a statement was made that, about the effort to bring about freedom. And it didn't say freedom was not a worthwhile goal, but it said you can't change things overnight. And the idea that Nat was overzealous in what he wanted to accomplish. Then in the summer of 1973, Stephen Oates, who at the time was living in Massachusetts, came to um, Southampton County, Virginia, to do research for his book. And I find that interesting because I was working in Virginia during the summer of '73, but I was in Pulaski in the southwest part of the state, near West Virginia, clear across the state. But it's interesting synchronicity that took place there. But when he went to get a check cashed, this banker came out to approve his credentials, and the usual question, "What are you doing so far away from home?" And when he uh, asked about, he said he was doing research for a book on Nat Turner, and this banker went into a monologue about the colored problem, and he had the same words that newspaper editorial did in 1832: "Can't change things overnight." And so that goes to show that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And um, the local historical society, Nat Turner's, at least at the time, was not their favorite person. I don't know about now. But there are people named with the Turner surname, uh, probably some white Turners, but there are definitely some black Turners who claim kin to him. And in the local black folklore, there's no question Nat Turner is still alive and well. And now, the the South cannot be painted with one brush as if it was all monolithic. Not all states of the Old South were equally dependent on slave labor. The Upper South, including Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, practiced a diversified agriculture of wheat, tobacco, hemp, vegetables, and livestock, which did not necessarily rely on slave labor. North Carolina is an interesting state in point, located geographically between Virginia and South Carolina. North Carolina has been described as a valley of humility located between two mountains of conceit. By contrast, the lower Deep South, including South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, pursued the great cash crops of cotton and sugar, which depended heavily on slave labor. As a result of the political crisis of 1861, the Upper South would approach secession more reluctantly than the Deep South. Despite their differences, however, they shared the institution of slavery, and that forged the Upper and Lower South into a single Old South, where the peculiar institution of slavery scarred all social relationships between blacks and whites, among whites and between blacks. Without slavery, the region known as the Old South would not have come into being. And we'll get to this later, but after the Civil War, they developed the New South. And one of the major differences was greater industrialization. And of course, they had to develop uh, new forms of labor. Sharecropping eventually became a substitute for slavery, and race relations. Well, to this very day, race relations are still a major issue. When we deal with Black Lives Matter, all the racist act by police officers and others, we're seeing that the issues that they dealt with during the Old South, the Civil War and Reconstruction, are by no means dead. The Cotton Kingdom is a broad swath of territory that stretched from South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida in the east through Alabama, Mississippi, central and western Tennessee, and Louisiana, and from there on to Arkansas and Texas. And so, cotton was a very important crop. That was not the only crop that was raised. As pointed out, depends on where you were. In places like North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky, tobacco was important crops. In South Carolina, they raised a lot of rice and indigo, and slaves were involved in all of this. And the slogan "Cotton is King" needs some clarification because there was some Southerners who took the position that no, cotton is not king, slavery is king, and cotton, the whole focus of secession was not on one agricultural product. But cotton was definitely important. After 1793, when Eli Whitney, a Yankee school teacher who was visiting Georgia, developed the cotton gin, that made cotton production much easier and much more profitable, indirectly gave a shot in the arm for slavery. The internal slave trade was a slave trade within the upper and lower South. And slavery went on, and the trade was, you know, there were sometimes rumors that slavery was more brutal in the lower South than the upper South. And a master who was trying to get his slaves to behave would threaten to send them further south if they didn't toe the line. In other words, one might be a slave in Virginia or North Carolina, and one will sell you down to Mississippi if we have to. The Tredegar Iron Works was located in Richmond, Virginia. It was the nation's fourth largest producer of iron products. And eventually they developed uh, a system in which they used entirely slave labor. The question has come up at different times, had slavery not ended what it did? And it's pretty much agreed by most historians that as the South diversified, they would have had to make more extensive use of slaves in factories and other types of production, and not strictly agriculture. And again, in Richmond, slaves were used in industry. There were slaves who did a lot of different things, and there was always the common distinction made between the field hands and the household servants. And by the way, the lighter skinned slaves more often than not got the jobs in the house, and some of them were masters' children, mulattoes. The term mulatto, by the way, is derived from mule. A mule is a hybrid between a donkey and a horse, and they're sterile. But the mulattoes are certainly not sterile, even though someone made the claim that they were. A mulatto is half black and half white. A quadroon is 3/4 white and 1/4 black. An octoroon is 7/8 white and 1/8 black. But based on the one drop rule, anyone with any measure of African ancestry was considered black. There was a popular event in New Orleans in the years leading up to the Civil War called the Quadroon Balls, which were attended only by wealthy white men. No black men were there at all, and no poor whites were there. They were very expensive affairs. Some of these men were locals, and some were from out of town who had business in New Orleans. And they would, whenever they would come to town, they would attend these balls in which they would court these free women of color, some mulattoes, some quadroons, and some octoroons. And some women were raised from birth to participate in this type of concubinage. And slavery definitely had an impact on the white South as a whole, not just on slave owners. Considerable diversity shaped white social structure both within and between the slaveholding and non-slaveholding classes. All the wealthy extreme were those slaveholders who owned hundreds of slaves, led lives of luxury. At the other extreme were those non-slaveholders who were barely scraped by from one day to the next. In 1860, only 1/4 of all white families in the South owned slaves. Of these, nearly half owned fewer than 5, and nearly 3/4 had fewer than 10. So it was only the extreme wealthy who had these very large plantations and households um, with a lot of slaves. The four main social groups among the Southern whites were the planters, owners of 20 slaves or more, small slaveholders, owners of fewer than 20 slaves, yeomen, who were family farmers and generally did not own slaves, and the pine barren folk. Some sources refer to these as po buckra, or poor white trash. Lawyers, physicians, merchants, and artisans did not fall into any of these agricultural groups, but tended to identify their interests as one or another of them. Rural artisans and merchants dealt primarily with yeoman farmers. Urban merchants and lawyers depended on the planters, adopted the viewpoint on most issues. Similarly, slave traders identified with the planters with whom they relied on their livelihood. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the uneducated son of a Tennessee blacksmith, made a fortune as a slave trader in Natchez, Mississippi. When the Civil War broke out, he enlisted in the Confederate Army as a private and rose swiftly to become the South's greatest cavalry general. Plantation slavery directed Forrest's allegiance surely as it did those of planters like Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. Nathan Bedford Forrest, he's one whose statue has been removed in Memphis, his hometown, and he was believed after the Civil War to have been the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. There are some sources, though, that claim that in his later years that he had a change of heart and had some more or at least less racist views. Now, I've been told one story that I'm rather skeptical about it, the truth of it, but it's been said that he took 45 slaves with him to war, and he told them that if you stay with me to the end of the war, and the south wins, I'll set you free. If the north wins, you'll be free anyway. And 4 of those slaves deserted, but 41 remained loyal to him to the end of the war. And as I say, I'm skeptical if that story is true or not, but that's what's been said. And um, a man I've devoted a great deal of research to over the last 40 years was Albert Pike, a native of Massachusetts who settled in Arkansas. And he was in his. I've been to his home in Little Rock. It's now the Arkansas Center for Decorative Arts. And Pike was a scholar of comparative religion, very brilliant man. He wrote many books and uh, above the heads of a lot of people then and now. And he um, he was a lawyer, a musician. He wore many hats, but he became a Confederate general. As far as we know, the only battle that he ever participated in was the Battle of Pea Ridge that occurred in northern Arkansas in March of 1862, in which he compared he commanded a brigade of American Indians. He was, as a lawyer, represented the 5 civilized tribes, and he sought to assure the Native Americans loyalty to the Confederacy. But Pike's statue was in Washington, D.C. until June the 19th of this year when it was forcibly taken down by vandals. And there's plenty of things online about that particular event. Uh, but while practicing law in Arkansas before the war, Pike owned a few slaves. He was never a planter. He didn't really care for the plow or for the shovel or any of those tools. But his clients were generally part of the planters. He was a Whig, and the mountain boys, as they called them, from northern and western Arkansas, tended to have less money, own fewer slaves, and vote Democratic. So he really didn't have much to do with them people. And it was the planter group that had more investments in slavery that Pike often represented in court. And plantation agriculture was characterized by a high degree of division of labor and dependence on the large-scale production of a single crop. The Southern code of honor was an extraordinary sensitivity to one's reputation, a belief that one's self-esteem depends on the judgment of others, and an insult can have tragic consequences. On page 328, it shows a picture of Charlotte Helen, her nurse Lydia, 1857, 10 days after Charlotte's birth, which occurred when the family sought refuge on Sullivan's Island, South Carolina. During the yellow fever epidemic, a terrible storm swamped the beaches. Lydia refused the aid of a soldier, trusting no one but herself, and waded through the swirling waters to carry Charlotte Helen to safety. And so there were certain bonds that were made across racial lines in spite of the white supremacist culture of the day. Now, the great planters who occupy pride of place in the popular mythology of the Old South actually represented a small minority of slaveholders. A substantial majority, 88% in 1860, owned fewer than 20 slaves. Most of these possessed fewer than 10. Like the planters, most Small slave owners were agriculturalists, but unlike the planters, small slaveholders often worked side by side with their slaves. They were farmers rather than planters. Non-slaveholding family farmers, or yeomen, comprised the largest single group of the Southern whites. Most yeomen owned their land. Many hired slaves at harvest time to help in the fields. Where the land was poor, as in eastern Tennessee, the landowner owning yeomen were typically subsistence farmers, but most grew some crops for the market. So subsistence mainly grew crops to feed their families, whereas uh, commercial farmers sought to sell on the marketplace. There's another term you hear even today as the gentleman farmers. Those are those who farm more for pleasure than for profit. They have another job or some source of income and they look upon farming as a hobby. Yemen could be found anywhere in the south, but they tended to congregate in the upland regions. In the southeast, they populated the Piedmont region, running through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. In the southwest, they usually lived in the hilly upcountry far from the rich alluvial soil of the deltas. A minority of yeomen, most of them young men, did not own land but lived with and worked for landowning relatives. And the um, in Arkansas, a lot of them were found in the Ozarks in the northern part of the state. And again, their culture was very different than the slaveholding residents of Arkansas. Anti-slavery Northerners sometimes pointed to the Pine Barren folk as living proof that slavery degraded poor whites, but Southerners shot back that the impoverished Pine Barren people could at least feed themselves, unlike the starving paupers of northern cities. In general, the people of the Pine Barrens were self reliant and fiercely independent. One reason they were regarded as lazy and shiftless was that men often refused to hire themselves out in what they call slave labor. Women similarly refused to work as servants. Neither victimized nor oppressed, these people generally lived in the Pine Barrens by choice. Again, some people call them Po Buckra or poor white trash, and those who were really at the bottom of the totem pole. It's been reported that some slaves turned their nose up at them. But these, the conflict the Northerners brought out about the Northern factory workers and the difference between them and the slaves, the Northern workers had the option of quitting if they didn't like their job. Unfortunately, slaves didn't have that option. And, um, and let me say this that among the Yeomen and among the Pine Barren folk, there was not a great deal of solidarity with slaves. They couldn't afford to own slaves. Some said they would own slaves if they could afford it. They looked up to the upper classes. Many hoped they could aspire to be slave owners one day, and they certainly did not appreciate slave labor. Some saw slaves as competitors for jobs, so they were no more pro-black than the slave owners were for the most part. And the there was a debate by the Virginia legislature over whether to abolish slavery following Nat Turner's revolt. It was ended by narrow defeat and abandoned as support for emancipation dwindled. The impending crisis of the South was written by Hinton R. Helper, who was a poor white. It called upon non slave owners to abolish slavery in their own interest. reveal the persistence of the degree of white opposition to slavery. Again, it was not um, rooted in any strong belief in racial equality, but the idea that slavery was making the South poor and non-slave holding whites were being hurt by it more than anybody. George Fitzhugh was a Virginian who contrasted the plight of northern factory workers, wage slaves who were callously discarded by their bosses when they were too old or too sick to work, with southern slaves who were led and clothed even when old and ill because they were the property of their conscientious masters. Some took care of them even in old age and sickness, some did not. And there's illustration here on page 333, two pictures, the Negro in his own country and the Negro in America. Pro-slavery protagonists contrasted what they believed to be blacks' African savagery with blessings of civilization on an American population. As you get closer to the Civil War, the tone changed in the pro-slavery polemics. In the early days, slavery was being presented as a necessary evil, but then they began more and more to present it as a positive good, that slaves as well as masters were benefited. The task system, slave labor system in which each slave had a daily or weekly quota of tasks to complete. And gang labor is slave labor system in which closely supervised groups of slaves work continuously at the same pace throughout the day. And there's also a depiction here on page 335 of a slave auction. And one of the worst public presentations of slavery. Canadian sketched the Charleston slave auction. One of the elements, one of the provisions of the Compromise of 1850 was abolition of the slave trade, although not slavery itself, in the District of Columbia. It was argued that for foreign diplomats to come to America and see the sale of human flesh in the nation's capital was just gave America a very bad image. There's pictures of black women and men on a trek home in South Carolina. Much like the northern factories, large plantation made it possible to impose discipline and order on their workforce. Here, black women loaded down with cotton joined their men on the march home after a day in the fields. Frederick Douglass is described here, a former slave who was the leading black abolitionist during the antebellum period. He was a mulatto who never knew his father and who was his mother's owner. And he was, he ran away from slavery in Maryland. And after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed as a part of the Compromise of 1850, he was persuaded by friends to allow them to buy him and officially free him, lest he be captured and returned to slavery, since he was considered, strictly speaking, still a fugitive. And he was married for many years to a black woman, and after she passed away, he married his white secretary. And he said that his first wife was the color of his mother, his second wife was the color of his father. Free blacks were those who were not slaves. Most of them lived in urban areas. The relatively specialized economies of the cities provided free people of color with opportunities to become carpenters, coopers, that is, barrel makers, barbers, and even small traders. So there was definitely a business and professional class among free blacks. It shows a picture of a barber shop in Richmond, Virginia in 1861. Free blacks dominated the barber's trade in Richmond on the eve of the war. As meeting places for men, barber shops supplied newspapers, political discussions. Black barbers were politically informed and prosperous. As was the custom of the time, barbers also performed medical procedures like drawing blood. It goes way back to the Middle Ages. You had a profession called barber surgeon, and in later years, of course, the barber and the surgeon went their separate ways, but they have historical roots. And the discussion here of people like Harriet Tubman, who led the Underground Railroad, Josiah Henson, who is was supposed to be the character, the model for the character, the main character in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. He's buried in Canada, I understand, and but despite overwhelming oppression for their condition, enslaved blacks succeeded in creating a distinctive culture that helped them survive slavery. The culture drew on both African American sources, but it was more than a simple mixture of the two. Enslaved blacks gave a distinctive twist to the American as well as um, African components of their culture. The black sociologist E. Franklin Frazier argued that in the enslavement, the dehumanization, it all came in this process that black culture was totally destroyed. African culture, that is. He has very little support among scholars today. He was in 1941 a Jewish anthropologist at Northwestern University in Chicago by the name of Melville J. Herskowitz. Wrote a book entitled The Myth of the Negro Past, in which he demonstrates that much African culture was preserved in spite of it all. And religion played an equally important role in slave resistance. Slaves transported from Africa practiced a range of religions. They shared a tendency to draw little distinction between the spiritual and material worlds. Africans believed that storms, illnesses, and earthquakes resulted from supernatural forces. Despite that commonality, different African religions were divided by specific beliefs, and as a result of these differences, African religions did not readily unify blacks in America. The religions of Africa were not monolithic, but were very diversified. Some parts of Africa had been penetrated by Islam, some had not. Islam is not a religion indigenous to Africa, but it was brought in the 7th century by the Arabs. Remnants of African religion persisted in part because before the 1790s, whites had made a little effort to convert slaves to Christianity. Um, After the 1790s, surviving African beliefs sometimes actually contributed to slaves' acceptance of Christianity, possibly in some cases um, because of perceived similarities to their own traditions. And many African traditions were based on water, and water had played a major role. And of the denominations that sought evangelism among the slaves, Baptists were most successful, and it appears that the Baptist practice of baptism by immersion had a special appeal. It's believed that many of the river religions, some of their priests were sold into slavery. It's been theorized that many later became Baptist ministers. Just as Africans believed that droughts and plagues resulted from supernatural forces, Christian revivalists knew in their hearts that every drunkard or Sabbath breaker who was struck by lightning had experienced a deliberate and direct punishment from God. And so they could identify with much of what they were being taught, and the syncretism, the blending of what they've been taught before with what the newfound Christian faith certainly was quite a mixture. Interpretations such as given here were quietly assisted by black preachers, slaves appointed and trained by white ministers to spread the white version of Christianity among the slaves. In the presence of those white ministers or their own masters, black preachers dutifully repeated the familiar biblical command, servants, obey your masters. Despite sanctions against meeting secretly, slaves often gathered for their own religious meetings apart from whites, and then the black preacher's message changed. They didn't hear much about Moses and the Exodus when they were under white supervision. And what developed in these clandestine meetings was what became known as the invisible institution of the black church of the slaves. After emancipation came, um, there was a blending of the invisible institution of the slaves with the uh, with the institutional church of free blacks. But eventually it all came together, and there's evidence of it today. Have a good day.